Hello and welcome to a Audio Engineering Society Historical Committee event. My name is David Bialik. I am the Broadcast Events Chair of the convention and also one of the organizers of this event. And this event is very special because WA2XMN is on the air. This event took a lot of work, and before we go on with the meat of the presentation today, I just want to explain the remote broadcast we are doing, and I have Herb Squire from DSI Systems to explain this with me. But first, I would like to just make some thanks to some of the exhibitors of the convention and other companies that have loaned us equipment to make this possible. AFEX Systems loaned us some processors and distribution amps. APT loaned us WorldNet Oslo. DSI loaned us the Red Line. WPLJ in New York loaned us some facilities. LPB loaned us the on-air light. Solid Electronic Labs obviously supplied the transmitter. CSC Management, the tower. And this wouldn't have been put together without the assistance of Radio World magazine. Herb?
Thank you, Dave. I know over my career in New York radio, which goes back a bunch of years, I've always been in a situation where we're trying to make ends meet, basically getting from point A to point B. And the facilities for this broadcast is quite unique, and its path is also quite unique. Obviously, the origination program is coming from here. It is wending its way via copper telco type wiring up to the APT, Audio Processing Technology, booth number 747, where it is being transmitted into a WorldNet Oslo, as David mentioned, which is a high quality audio codec, which is then converting that output, which is a multiple channel, which is also piggybacking on an existing demo that we're doing in that booth. I'm with DSI RF Systems, and we are working with APT as well as Redline Communications out of Toronto, providing license-free 5.8 gigahertz radios. And this was a perfect marriage because we could do our demo, we could provide the program link from here to the transmission center, which is the radio in the rack in the room, and then the antenna's up on the roof, a little 1-foot panel antenna. And also we're transmitting that up to the 85th floor of the Empire State Building, to WPLJ's FM transmitter room. Now, it's interesting to note, if you look at the pictures, especially looking at the actual balanced modulator breadboard that Major Armstrong used for the initial FM tests done at the National Broadcasting Company's experimental television facility on the 85th floor of the Empire State Building. And actually, the Major used the 85th floor for all his breadboard equipment and his testing center, and then it went out into the existing television transmitter at 44 megacycles. But in this case, we're receiving the digital transmission on the 85th floor, going into the WPLJ's transmitter room, being turned around to the equipment that WPLJ has to link up to their backup transmitter site at the Alpine Tower. And at the Alpine Tower, that signal is then transmitted or relayed locally, internally in the building, to the WA2XMN transmitter operating at 42.8 megacycles. I have to make it megacycle. I can't say megahertz. It just doesn't sound right. So we're doing this transmission, and I think it's a unique experience, especially from what I can tell, and I have to go back to my office and verify some of the old drawings we have of the Empire State Building, because the room that the Major used, I found out recently in the past couple days, was the room that NBC used for the television studio, where one end of the room was the scanner room where the mechanical flying spot scanner was located. This is the days before the iconoscope even. So it's a very interesting time in history, and I believe, I'm almost 85% certain that the room that was used is pretty much where WPLJ's transmitter is located right now. So we're repeating history all over again.
And I just want to let you know that this whole hop talk was the discussion with Herb and I for many mornings, because we only decided to try and broadcast this around a month ago.
Not even, I don't know.
And we drove everybody crazy, including the AES office, to get this done and because this is important, and FM, despite what everybody might think, is still where most people find out where the music that everyone else is making is. So, without further ado, you've heard about other formats called Jack. Well, this is Major Radio. Scott?
Good afternoon. The life and works of Major Edwin Howard Armstrong are truly the stuff of American legend. If you're here at the Javits Center with us, and certainly if you're one of those tuned in this afternoon at 42.8 megacycles, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with the broad outlines of Edwin Armstrong's story. His boyhood days in the big house high on the hill in Yonkers, experimenting with wireless and terrifying the neighbors with his aerial stunts high up above the rooftop. His first big inventions, regenerative feedback and the superheterodyne receiver that helped make broadcast radio a reality. His service in World War I, which earned him the rank of major that he bore so proudly for the rest of his life. His early friendship with David Sarnoff, who'd go on to build RCA and NBC, and who would go on to ask Armstrong some years later for a box to get rid of static. And of course, the years of research and experimentation that turned that box into a brand new medium, high-fidelity, static-free, frequency modulation radio. You know the struggles that followed as well, the split with RCA that led Armstrong to leave the Empire State Building and to build his own FM facility across the Hudson River in Alpine, New Jersey. The early triumphs of FM radio, like this 1941 link-up from Alpine all the way up to Mount Washington in New Hampshire. The first voice you're going to hear on this archival recording will be that of the Major.
Oh, good night, everybody.
Good night from Boston.
Good night, Major. This is Mount Washington.
And good night from Paxton.
Good night from Meriden.
This is W1XOJ Boston, the frequency-modulated high-frequency broadcast station owned and operated by the Yankee Network with transmitting facilities at Paxton, Massachusetts. This concludes the broadcasting activities of W1XOJ for today. We will return to the air at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Good night.
All accomplished without the use of AT&T's long lines. Then came the war and the forced move of FM to a new frequency band, and of course the titanic patent battles that took over the Major's life and in the end drove him to his death 51 years ago, depriving him of the chance to see his invention become universally accepted and successful beyond his wildest imagination. But perhaps you don't know about the revival of interest in the Major and his works in recent years. It began with Tom Lewis's book, Empire of the Air, and the Ken Burns documentary that followed. It was renewed on the 50th anniversary of the Major's death about a year and a half ago, when Armstrong admirers gathered for a vigil on a chilly East Side street in Manhattan. And it blossomed on a humid early summer day just this past June when hundreds of the Major's fans made a pilgrimage to his tower site on the Palisades. They gathered outside in a tent set up on the Alpine grounds, and inside in what had been the Major's lab, and around the metropolitan area on 42.8 megacycles and on WFDU 89.1, and around the world on the web, they listened as a panel of Armstrong's colleagues, family members, and modern-day historians shared their insight into the life and legend of Major Edwin Howard Armstrong. We are honored today to be able to bring that panel together again. With us this afternoon, Robert Carter Brecht, the Major's great-nephew and a frequent visitor to the Armstrong summer home in New Hampshire. Raise your hands, we're going alphabetically here, so say hello as we go here. Steve Hempel, owner of Solid Electronic Labs. His admiration for the Major led him to build, by hand mind you, the transmitter over which this broadcast is right now being carried. Gil Houck of Houck and Bowen Engineers. His uncle Harry Houck was one of the Major's closest associates and the source of much of the documentation that we have today about the Major's work. Mike Katstorn, one of the Major's biggest fans. It was Mike who took the Harry Houck collection, preserved it, and placed it and much more on the web, creating the most extensive site on Armstrong that exists. And write down that URL because you're going to want to spend a couple hours or perhaps a couple of days perusing everything that's in store there. It is truly remarkable. Renville McMahon, who began working for the Major when he was just 13 and who went on to an illustrious career of his own at the CBS Technology Center and elsewhere. Gerry Minter of Components Corporation. Gerry was an associate of the Major's who was present at the sign-off of his historic Alpine FM station after the Major's death in 1954. Charles Sacrament Jr. of CSC Management, LLC. The Sacrament family, first Charles Sr. and now his son, have owned the Armstrong Tower in Alpine for many years, and they take their custodianship of the Major's physical legacy very, very seriously. We should also note that family commitments prevented Henry Dietz of Radio Engineering Labs, the company that made much of the Major's early FM equipment, from joining us today as was originally scheduled. We are sorry that he couldn't be with us. And I'm your moderator, Scott Feibush of Radio World and Northeast Radio Watch. You will have an opportunity to ask questions later in the program, and I certainly hope you'll take advantage of that. Right now, let's turn to our panelists and begin asking them a few questions. I want to start with Bob Brecht. We'll be talking a lot in this discussion about Major Armstrong, the inventor, about Major Armstrong, the engineering innovator. Right now, we want to talk about your Uncle Howard. Tell me a little bit, what was it like? At what point growing up did you realize that your Uncle Howard was a legend in the broadcasting industry?
Well, I was 13 years old when Uncle Howard fell to his death, and the times that I was in his presence were, I would say, from my age of about 8 years to the end of his life. We were frequent visitors with my sister and my mother and father to their home in Rye Beach, New Hampshire. He was an imposing and towering figure without an 8-year-old knowing anything about his achievements. He was his presence was most impressive, and certainly in my eyes at age 8, I'd never seen anyone quite so impressively bald. They planned for our visits impeccably. Their hospitality was flawless. The environment was gracious in the way of an age that has passed now. Those visits are among my fondest memories of growing up. Their friends were extraordinary. They were captains of industry. The things that they found for my sister and I to do as children while we were there were most unusual and always things that children of our age delighted in. They were absolutely wonderful hosts to anybody who walked through their doorway.
This was up in Rye Beach, New Hampshire?
In Rye Beach, New Hampshire, yes.
We should point also that you are not the only Armstrong family member in the room today.
No, that's right. My son is here in the front row down here, and I have a very fond memory of him around age 7 or so, sitting in the little garden outside their sunroom in Rye Beach, New Hampshire, reading the first short story he had written to his Aunt Marion.
Ren McMahon, when you were 13, you actually went to work for the Major. Tell us about how you became involved in actually working at Alpine at such a young age.
Well, I think like anybody interested in electronics or radio, there was no electronics in those days. I was aware of Major Armstrong, but I was lucky enough that my father knew him slightly. My father had been a member of the Radio Club of America right from the beginning, though he was not an engineer, he was in business. And one day we had lunch with George Burkhardt, who was one of Armstrong's very close friends. And during the lunch, somewhere I mentioned that, gee, I wish I could get over and see the tower and all at that time. And whereas my father, I don't think, didn't know Armstrong well enough or didn't have enough nerve to ask him, Burkhardt said, well, I'm seeing him during the week. I'm having dinner with him, and let me see what I can do. And sure enough, a week later, Armstrong gave me a call and asked if I would come over. And I did, and I met Perry Osborne, who was heading up the station at Alpine then. And Then I went home again, and I got another call, this time, I guess, to my father first, but then to me, asking whether I'd like to have a job working over there that summer. And so that was the summer of 1940, I think. And I really only worked a week or so then, but the summer of 41, I worked for the full summer over there. And from there on until 1952 or 53, except for a time in the Navy, I continuously worked for him during vacations and summertime.
We're going to come back more to that in a little bit. Gerry Minter, you were an associate of the Major in his later years. You were there, as we mentioned, the night that the station signed off. We were talking earlier, and you said that the Major wanted to go up in your airplane and take some measurements. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Well, he actually called me on the phone several times and would ask if the plane would be available. When he first contacted me about it, I said, well, I assume you want to make some measurements. Yes. I said, well, you want some power, I suppose. And I said, I'll have to get a converter because I only have a 12-volt battery in my plane. So I bought a little converter. It was good for about 150 watts. And I asked him if that would be enough. And he said that would be adequate. And so I did have the converter ready. And then he never set a permanent date. He would call up and say, is it plane available? I said, yes. And he wanted how far I could go. Well, I explained that I could go as far as Pittsburgh and turn around and come back without having to refuel, or I could go twice that, of course. He said that was adequate for what he wanted to do. But I never knew exactly what he wanted to measure, or for that matter, what frequency we're talking about. I had worked as a favor for a friend of mine in Texas who had a contract in New York, and he wanted to measure something. I'd done some work with my plane previously to find out that the place he wanted to put the antenna did not have enough pickup. It had to be much higher. By flying out in Pennsylvania and actually making measurements, my company built test equipment to make signal measurements. And so I had some experience with that a little bit in my plane, but I never got a chance to use it. And as a matter of fact, Major Armstrong called me up the day before he died. And this bothered me a great deal because I couldn't imagine that the man would be so concerned about technical matters committing suicide. So one of my friends actually got worried about this and did quite an investigation to see if there's anybody could possibly going to visit him, could have pushed him out the door. In other words, he actually checked with the doorman at the place. He spent a lot of time on this and never able to locate any way he could account for it. So it's still a mystery to me how a person could be interested to talk to me the day before about using the plane and then commit suicide the next day. That's hard to understand. And that's about it. I had been dinner guest, by the way, with my wife and I at his place several months prior to this. And Mrs. Armstrong had shown us all the piles of paperwork that he had to do. And she seemed a little bit put out with the paperwork, and I guess that was one of the things that led to misunderstanding, was that it was tiresome because he wasn't getting anywhere, just arguing back and forth about legal matters. And that's about all I knew. I didn't really know him real well that I worked with him or had anything like that. I did do one thing. I supplied a circuit for the first transmitter that had low phase error at low frequencies. That was my first patent. And I didn't meet him at the time. I supplied this to a friend of mine, but there were 3 of those amplifier circuits in the first transmitter. It was a thing that I worked on in my thesis at MIT earlier and had not gotten a good result. So I finally got a job and got the proper gear to build the filter the way I wanted to make it. So I had worked with him indirectly many years ago, and also built an FM station in 1937, 38, receiver, to receive his station. And so I was very much interested in what he was doing. And I met him through the radio club, of course, but I didn't really know him personally, and I never visited his home. And then later, after he passed away, I went up to the summer place and gave a copy of the record to Mrs. Armstrong, which we made to sign the station off. I had the undesirable job of doing that. I had to make a record to sign it off, and which I did. And We also had a problem. I plugged my tape machine in, and the tape took off and oscillated, and I found out that after several hours that the first tube of my Ampex had a little getter coil in the first tube, the 6SJ7. It resonated at 92 megacycles. I had to solder the ground directly to the shell, and that solved the problem. So I learned something about why he never wanted to have I offered several times to bring my machine up and play it on the air, and he would never take me up on that. Now I know why, because he had the problem. He had a tape machine there, which he didn't use apparently because he had feedback trouble. Same problem I had.
And we will hear at the end of our panel today, at the end of our broadcast, a short excerpt of that broadcast from 1954, and we'll talk more with Gerry about that later on today. Gil Houck, your uncle, Harry Houck, was one of the Major's closest associates for many years. Talk a little bit about his work and about what he did with the Major and what his role was in the laboratories at Alpine and at Columbia.
My uncle met the Major during World War I over in France. That's what began their association. Then, of course, my uncle, I think he ended up staff sergeant, not a major. And they maintained their friendship after the war in New York. My uncle worked with the Major on the superheterodyne. They were having problems. My uncle worked on that. In fact, he was the one who was responsible for the second harmonic version. My uncle did work for him. He worked at another facility, and but he did make coils for the Major for many of his things. And the Major always thought that Harry did the best coil winding. Whether that's true or not, I can't vouch for it. But that was basically, and I never saw a man so upset in my life in the 50s when the Major passed away as my uncle. He was just consumed by it. He couldn't accept it either. It was just too much.
And of course, Harry Houck is remembered to us today also for the collection that he assembled of Armstrong equipment and of Armstrong documentation, and much of that today now resides on Mike Katstorn's website. Mike, talk a little bit, if you would, about how this collection all came together and how it came to you and how you came to put all this together on the web for everyone.
Well, sure. The genesis of this collection, of course, was Harry Houck meeting Armstrong in France, and each of them being very impressed with each other. Harry returned to the States first, had some letters of recommendation from the Major, didn't use them, went to work for another company, and as Gil just said, had quite an association with the Major right up until the time of his death. Well, when the Major died, very, very shortly after that, Harry went to visit Columbia University, and at Columbia University they have what's called dead rooms. And they, in those rooms, determined what pieces of equipment should be kept and what pieces of equipment should be gotten rid of in one way or another. Harry Houck was fortunate and very forward-thinking in that he got his hands on a lot of this stuff. Much of it he got that way from Columbia. That's why the Empire State breadboards, for instance, survived. Probably virtually any piece of Armstrong stuff that survives that I have anyway came through Columbia, some of it through some of Armstrong's friends that Harry knew at the radio club. But basically that's how the equipment came to survive. Now, Harry was planning on opening a museum. He had two storage locations that he kept this material in, one near Harrisburg, one in New Jersey. Gil and I went and retrieved this equipment. It was kind of on the verge of being destroyed. The barn was falling down in one location, and the other location we had to get out of the place. So in the end, we cleared the stuff out. I've kept it together, tried to present it on the website so that people could enjoy it, and that's about the size of it.
Excellent. For the benefit of our listeners out there in low-band FM land, Mike, what do you have down there?
Well, the first item is a JFM 90. General Electric was the first manufacturer to really appreciate what FM could do, and of course Armstrong was great friends with GE, and General Electric produced the JFM 90 is the first mass-produced FM radio receiver. You could find this receiver in two flavors. The standalone that used an external amplifier, and the console version that had the FM tuner incorporated in with the standard AM big console of the day. REL, a company that Armstrong went back quite a ways with, and in fact in the 20s, REL had manufactured a regenerative receiver that got Sarnoff mighty upset. And Armstrong, after losing priority on regeneration to Lee DeForest, actually used that opportunity to enter back into a battle with DeForest on priority to regeneration. But I digress. That was earlier. Later, REL manufactured the first, what I call commercial radio receiver. It wasn't designed to be sold to the public. It's primarily a receiver that was designed to be used as an FM monitor at FM radio stations. Frank Gunther, who was president of REL, told me that they made about 300 of them, and the first customer was the FCC, who needed a radio, a high-quality radio that they could use to monitor what they expected to be a real flood of FM stations. So that's where quite a few of them went. You don't see many of these around. So apparently when the FM stations and the FCC got rid of them, they really got rid of them. They are heavy son of a gun, so they didn't travel too far. This is the breadboard that we've already talked about. It's one of the very first stages in the FM system that was breadboarded up in the Empire State Building, put together in Columbia University, obviously, where he had set it up and tested it and got it going. It was moved up to the Empire State Building and operated very successfully for a number of years, proved FM, made almost everybody a believer, but RCA was getting busy on television at that time, so they didn't show a whole lot of interest. This is the first production FM radio, or one of 25, I should say. Just before Alpine went on the air, Armstrong contracted with GE to make 25 of these radios. He needed something that was presentable. Everything before this had been made in the lab, and they were all not very user-friendly and a little on the ugly side for the standard consumer to look at. So he had 25 of these made so he could demonstrate throughout New York, the environs, wherever a signal could be received. It was used for demonstration purposes, is my understanding. This particular one, I think the reason it survived, and as far as I know, only one other has survived. This one was used in patent litigation after World War II. So it, no doubt, was at Columbia, and that's why it survives today. The tag on the front is a receipt that the patent office stamped indicating what it was there for and who it belonged to. So that's the equipment I brought. I've got some paperwork here. You can You can look at it, of course, when you feel like it. The #1 logbook from Alpine is kind of interesting. That details everything from the day they flipped the transmitter on for the first time up through the very famous first day of regular broadcasting. There's a number of these logbooks. This is, to me, the most interesting. There was also another series of logbooks. These were the equipment logbooks that Armstrong and his people used to document just everything that was at that station. My assumption would be that if somebody followed these step by step and put a station together, it would look very much like Alpine because it's very detailed. Here's some clippings from newspapers about that day when he died. And this is an interesting little board that Armstrong wrote showing his appreciation for a test that was done. To the chief operator on the night of the radio club paper, in sincerest appreciation for a perfect demonstration, signed E.H. Armstrong. I assume this proudly hung in somebody's office, I don't know whose, for a number of years, and no doubt came to Columbia, although I can't be sure about something personal like that. So come up and enjoy the things, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you for bringing them. I'm going to have you hand the mic off to Charles Sacrament. And for those of you who have never had the opportunity to get over to Alpine to see what's over there, it is truly a remarkable site because so much of what the Major did at Alpine has been preserved over the years. The site was sold to the Sacrament family by Columbia University after the Major's death. And there is a lot still out there. We have a few pictures from the June event out there, and I will ask Chuck to come up here and narrate a little bit. This, of course, the Major's original transmitter building.
Thanks, Scott. Yes, it's a two-story masonry building built in 1937. The original laboratory was on the first floor, and the Major's office was up on the second floor.
And over the door there?
Over the door is the famous W2XMN call sign. We've tried to preserve the building. The masonry portion of the building's been repointed, and certainly we've tried to keep as much of the history alive as possible.
That little globe off to the left of the stairs probably deserves some mention as well.
Yes, it does. That's actually a replica of the famous handstand globe. My late father, who got involved in the site in the 60s, was a very big Armstrong fan, and did what he could to put things like that together back at the site, and actually started the small museum that we have currently located on the first floor of that building.
And we'll get in there in a moment. This would be what you see when you walk through the door, basically.
Yes, this is the inside of the first floor of that building. There's actually the original beacon light off to the right there, and to the left basically is different equipment that we put together for that event. And this is the inside of what was the original laboratory. As you can see, a lot of the equipment is a combination of test equipment and amateur radio equipment, and off to the right we have some newer two-way test equipment, and just trying to sort of preserve a timeline with both test equipment and some production models. And off to the right there are some tubes, and just trying to gather a timeline of history for people to appreciate.
I actually don't have a photo here of the back room, but if you can talk for a moment about what's back there as well.
Sure. In the back room, we had a phonograph and several receivers. In fact, we have a Stromberg Carlson receiver that hadn't been powered for probably about 15, maybe more, probably about 20 years. And the day that Steve actually came up, we first fired up the transmitter, we decided to pull it out and blow the dust off it. And believe it or not, except for the electric cord, which we both almost got fried on, it came right up. So, yeah, we had a little bit of smoke. And That's a modern-day view of the tower. As you can see today, the amazing thing about this structure, every time I look at it, the foresight for being able to mount antennas and get distance between antennas, it just amazes me. Today, obviously, building a structure of this size would be very expensive, but it's such a great tool for us to be able to utilize for just about every type of wireless communications you can think of is operating from that facility today. That is a picture of a new building that was built in 1990 at the base. It's a 6,900 square foot building. Prior to this, all the equipment was located in little trailers or shelters around the base of the tower. This building enabled us to bring all that equipment into a environmentally safe environment. We've upgraded the power. We've centralized the air conditioning systems and basically brought the housing portion of the facility up to modern day requirements.
From there, we will head inside and we will turn over to Steve Hempel to talk about this particular unit that's living in one of the rooms in that building. And Steve, tell people what it is exactly that we're looking at here.
Well, that view on the left, Scott, that's the frontal shot of the replica transmitter that I built on 42.8 megahertz. I should say, as Herb was saying earlier, I should really say megacycles to kind of put things in perspective for the day. The image up on the upper right is actually a photograph of the heart of the transmitter, which is the phasotron modulator tube. It was a tube that was designed specifically for FM modulator service by the General Electric Company. I would say back in the late 1930s, Dr. Robert Adler was the person that's responsible for its design, and most people today certainly don't know who Dr. Adler was in terms of the phasotron, but just about everybody knows that what a remote control is for a TV set, and Dr. Adler is the one that's credited with the creation of the television remote control, so that kind of links his name to TV fame. But that's what that object is there, and then the photograph to the below the modulator tube is a picture of the front window in the transmitter that shows the two output tubes that raise the power level of the transmitter up to the 250 watt level, and you can see the tubes glowing happily in all their glory there for us. So you don't find tubes in transmitters today except at the very, very high power level, but back in the 1930s, of course, they were pretty much standard at all levels, low level, high level, everything. So in doing the reproduction, it was important to me that I try and maintain that same level of technology that was used by Major Armstrong back in those days.
Steve is far too modest to say it, but the level of workmanship on this transmitter is just absolutely remarkable. I was just out there this morning, and I am struck silent every time I see it. It's just that neat. We have one more photo, just to sort of set the context. This is the 85th floor of the Empire State Building, as it appears, if not necessarily today, then at least a few months ago. And that green door on the left is actually the door to the WPLJ transmitter room through which this broadcast is passing. And this entire floor was NBC's for many, many years. So somewhere on this floor is where Major Armstrong did his earliest FM work, and it's also an important part of the context that brings us here today. This is WA2XMN, Alpine, New Jersey, broadcasting at 42.8 megacycles in frequency modulation from the historic Armstrong Tower site. And we are coming to you from the 119th AES convention at the Jacob Javits Center in New York City. So from there, I want to continue with the panel, and actually I'll come back to Steve first. Let's talk a little bit about what brought us here today and what brought us to Alpine in June. How did this whole latest round of Armstrong commemorations get started?
Well, I suppose I may be the one to blame for this. Back in December of 2004, I had gotten an invitation from two gentlemen, Ted Hartson and Walt Siakura, to attend a special commemorative that they were having for Major Armstrong's passing. It was the 50th anniversary, and both Ted and Walt had decided to do a little walk by at River House. River House is the last apartment building where Major Armstrong lived, where he actually committed suicide. And I didn't know Walt, and I didn't know Ted. And in fact, that was the first night that I met Ren for the first time, because Ren had decided to join with us, and I'm just so glad I decided to attend, and it just touched me very deeply. And I thought from there, I really, being a broadcast engineer and owing my entire life's work and everything, every dollar, every nickel I've ever made as a result of Major Armstrong's work, I thought that it would be the least I could do to honor him, to try and commemorate him in some way. And just searching the history, I found that the 70th anniversary of the first public demonstration of FM radio, which actually I have to admit wasn't conducted at Alpine, but it was actually between Randy Runyon's home in Yonkers, New York, and the present IRE building at the time, which I know is in the city here somewhere. I'm not exactly sure, but I thought this event was rather significant, and why not tie Alpine into it at the same time? I really didn't want to wait until the 1939 anniversary of the first transmission at Alpine. There's too many years to go by, and I was too excited about it. So I figured, okay, the 70th is the closest commemoration we can do, and why not make a few phone calls and see if I could get a few people interested. And when I contacted Chuck Sacrament at Alpine, and Chuck was more than accommodating, was very, very happy. He and his entire family and the whole staff at Alpine had just bent over backwards to help us craft this anniversary of this first public demonstration. And that's pretty much how it got started.
The transmitter to get licensed, 42.8 megacycles, excuse me, Herb, is not a frequency, obviously, that's in the broadcast service today. What did you go through to get permission from the FCC to go up with wideband FM on a band that hasn't been used in going on 50 years for that purpose?
Well, sure, it wouldn't be a real proper, authentic reproduction unless we actually did it in the Major's original frequency, and of course that was in the 40 megahertz band or megacycle band, and which today is primarily used by public safety users such as police and fire departments, that sort of user. The broadcasters have long since been reallocated from those frequencies. So what I had to do was approach the FCC and some private individuals that coordinate these frequencies today and get the permission of the land mobile industry to use these frequencies for this special event. And they were most accommodating after I had explained to them what the situation was and who Major Armstrong was, and the fact that they also owed quite a bit to the man. They decided, okay, we will allow you to do this on a temporary basis, and they gave me permission to do it. I went to the FCC. Likewise, they bent over backwards to get our grant. Originally, I had only gotten permission to do it for a 90-day period, what the FCC calls an STA. It's a special temporary authority. But of late, I've also been granted, or just been granted, a full 5-year experimental license to continue the commemoration. We'd like to go forth and do some of the Yankee Network recreations that the Major did. So we're going to keep going for a few years, thank goodness.
We'll talk more about that in a little bit, too. Let's talk about some of what the Major left us, and I want to turn now to the men who knew him and who worked with him. Being that we're here at AES, we can afford to perhaps get a little more technical than we could in Alpine in June. Talk a little bit about his legacy as an engineer and about some of the significant things. I mean, we know about FM, we know about superheterodyne. Why should engineers today look back on Major Armstrong with reverence and with respect? Ren?
Well, first of all, the things he did, there was nothing to go on. There had been nothing before. And one of the specific things I'll mention, which I guess most of you have read in the books, but it's certainly factual, is that he was the first person to deliberately make a vacuum tube oscillate. And up until that time, people really, and that included DeForest, as came out in some of the patent fights, even DeForest didn't know how the darn thing worked. He thought it had something to do with the gas in the tube, and he was putting critical amounts of gas in. And Armstrong decided to, when he was in his teens, to look at that, and he plotted the very first plate current versus grid voltage curves. He understood the tube, and from that he decided that to make it more sensitive for a receiver, which is what he was looking for at first, would be to pump some of the energy back in, make it go around the circle like perpetual motion, and regenerate the signal, where if you advanced it a little further, you got an oscillation. Now, those of you who know that DeForest finally won that patent, but after Armstrong had gotten the Medal of Honor from the IRE in those days, now the IEEE, Armstrong offered to give it back, and they unanimously voted to have him keep it, because it was obvious to an engineer that he really and truly had invented the thing and understood it, whereas DeForest's patent thing was based on the fact, and which he only filed after Armstrong, that he had an amplifier, an audio amplifier, that they were trying to sell. I think he was trying to sell it to AT&T, and the thing had squealed once or twice. Now, he didn't understand why it was squealing. He didn't understand any of that if you read the stuff, but it had squealed. And the patent department decided that therefore he had precedence, that he was the first one to make it oscillate, even though he didn't know what he was doing. Everything after that was also carefully thought out by him, and it was the first time. I mean, we were working in a field in which nobody had tubes before. They didn't have any idea what they could do. And in World War II, and it gets to something he did later, but in World War I, they were trying to pick up the airplanes, the German airplanes, over in France, and the ones coming from Germany, and the idea was to pick up the ignition noise from the planes, and to do that you needed a very sensitive receiver. And there are other people had worked in this area. There was a Frenchman who Armstrong fully acknowledged. But from that work, Armstrong came up with the idea of this superheterodyne. Again, understood what, and it had. I'm not sure at that point in my life, had I been born back then, that I would have been aware of what a heterodyne was, much less to use it in one to make a very sensitive receiver. Super regenerative receiver was the same sort of thing. That came after the super het, and was marvelously sensitive, and it would probably had a major thing to do with in World War II, with our protecting the Navy when the kamikaze were diving on them, because all of the proximity fuses used the super regenerative circuit. Again, it was a new area for people. And in FM, after other people and good people had determined that there was nothing useful in FM, and it was Carlson of the AT&T who wrote a paper on the subject and concluded at the end of the paper that FM had no had inherently distorted and had no compensating advantages whatsoever. He sort of missed the point. Armstrong had to build a good FM modulator, and things like reactance tubes and all just didn't cut it for the sort of thing he wanted to do. So he invented the dual channel modulator, which was later obsoleted by other and even better techniques. But at the time, it was a brand new technique to the world. Going further from that, he gave a lot of thought to methods of heterodyning, obviously from the superheterodyne on. And one of the things that I worked on with him during the war, along with other people, was on a long-range radar, which used FM principles and where we were tracking planes out to several hundred miles. And later on, that particular radar, and he was very proud of the fact that he was a major and connected with Fort Monmouth and with the Evans Signal Lab there. We had the idea, I did actually, well, gee whiz, we've got this big antenna, this big bed spring antenna that the Signal Corps had loaned us, and that's what we were using to pump 50 kilowatts into of radar's energy. That's continuous power, not pulse power. And that's why we got the very big ranges. And we thought, gee whiz, when the moon comes up over the horizon, why don't we aim that thing at the moon and see if we can get a signal back? And he wouldn't hear of it. And it turned out the reason he wouldn't hear of it is he was so proud of his connections with the Army and his major title and all, that he wanted the Army to do that first. And our equipment was transferred over to the Evans Signal Laboratory at Fort Monmouth, and I forget what year it was now, but 50-something, why the first signal was received from the moon using that equipment. So everything he did was things that had not been done before, and he couldn't go back and look at somebody else's paper and say, well, I'll do it a little better or a little change it. He had to do it from scratch. So my conclusion, and I've been lucky enough to work with various brilliant people, I think he's by far in his field the most brilliant one I've ever met. And, I'm just proud that I had all early training in my life working with him.
Gil or Gerry, anything from an engineering perspective that you'd like to add to our appreciation of the Major?
Not really, no, but I could just kind of back up Mr. McMahon here, that he was a great engineer, probably the greatest engineer that the wireless radio or electronic age will ever see.
I don't think you're going to get a lot of argument here today. And it certainly bears noting, I don't think that Dave has planned any DeForest memorial panels at any point in the near future. Let's move forward a little bit to the early days of FM. My own piece in all of this is as a broadcast historian. I've been working for too many years now on a history of New York City FM radio, which is, of course, a history that could not have been written without the Major. It would be impossible to imagine without the Major. And it's been remarkable to me to see the very fast takeoff that FM radio really had in the years before the war, and the way that it really became a broadcast medium unto itself at the very end of the 30s and the very beginning of the 40s. And perhaps, Mike, I know you've got some documentation of this. Talk a little bit about where FM was headed and what some of the early promise was as W2XMN began to bear offspring like W71NY and some of the other big early FM stations here.
Well, frankly, I don't think I'm the best guy to talk about that. Somebody else in this panel has to be more qualified to talk about that. Steve,
we're going to end up back with Ren here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say a little on it. Well, first of all, going just into 1940 and 41, when this Alpine station was on the air and other stations were going on the air. In fact, I went to school for a few years up in Wallingford, Connecticut, and we could pick up the Armstrong station quite well there on a little Meissner tuner. Any store you went into, there were no electronic stores then, there were radio stores, and any one of them had receivers for sale. I don't know, and this question was asked once before, I think, that how many of them were out there, but in 1942, I have a list of stations that were on the air, and there were multiple stations in every state of the United States, and if in 42, and if you assume that every one of those stations had at least a few listeners, 10 or 15, well, you're going to find out that, multiply it up, and you had hundreds of thousands of listeners at the time. And then everything stopped during the war because they couldn't build receivers for the home front and the FM, and Armstrong was busy doing other things, but he continued broadcasting during that time. And after the war, and I guess this is brought out in some of the books, but it's very, very true, that RCA, and I don't think it had anything to do with their patent position or liking or not liking FM, what RCA did not want, they owned NBC, and they had the red and the blue networks, and they didn't want there to be any more networks. And it was be very hard in those days for anybody to start a new competitive network other than the 3 or 4 that were then operating, because there weren't, the AT&T couldn't supply the extra lines. And here you had a system where each station could relay to the next station, and which we did, and you could have high quality with no use of the telephone company at all. And that's the last thing that Sarnoff wanted. So he brought, which in my mind was some tainted testimony as to why the FM band should be shifted. And of course, what he really wanted to do was slow everything down, which unfortunately he succeeded in doing. And it was, 10, 20 years before it really started to pick up again. Television was just starting, and the public was naturally interested in television. We shouldn't forget that every television receiver has a FM sound channel. So he did get some royalties from some of that for a while. But I would say that that was the major reason. You didn't have probably the major company in selling receivers and things in those days, RCA. You had them not only not pushing it, but doing their best to see that it didn't go.
And yet, even in spite of that, WOR here in New York was spending money on a fancy transmitter plant, and there was separate programming going on. I think by my estimate at one point in the early 40s, there were at least 8 or 9 stations that were on the air with regular FM programming here in New York. And sadly, a decade later, we'll remind those of you listening over the air that this is WA2XMN, Alpine, New Jersey, broadcasting at 42.8 megacycles in frequency modulation. Can't get enough of that, what can I say? Let's move forward a little bit into some of the things that the Major was experimenting with towards the end of his life. We know that there were experiments in FM multiplexing that he was working on, was sending multiple audio programs, a number of them at once, over a single carrier. What were some of the things that, had the Major not gotten tied up in these patent fights and had he not gotten into all these legal distractions, what were some of the directions that he was moving in towards the end?
Well, towards his end, of course, I wasn't working with him anymore. I was at NBC at that time. But the ones you mentioned were there. He was working on stereo. I was just remarking with Gerry McMahon before. That was happening while I was still there. In fact, I built some of the equipment. And the thing that absolutely kills me after all these years is when, I guess it was Murray Crosby, whoever, and RCA and stereo broadcasting came up with the idea of the L plus R and L minus R as a way of getting the signal through without adding too much more information into the subcarrier that you put on there. And it seemed like such an obvious idea. And how come that none of us, including Armstrong, thought of it? Because that was a major improvement. But we were working on that. We were working with John V.L. Hogan, a name I'm sure many of you know. And he was very big in facsimile at that point. And we were transmitting a subcarrier with carrying weather maps and information to the farmers. And that was still being transmitted on 42.8 megahertz, and because of course we hadn't moved the band in. By the way, just while I think of it here, because the 42.8, but of course afterwards we went on with a transmitter that we built on in the 92 whatever it was megahertz band. But at least the FCC was nice enough when they gave that the call letters. That was K2XEA, was in the EA standing for Edwin Armstrong. I think the FCC was very sorry that they had done what they did, particularly when their chairman moved and took a job with RCA shortly after having made the change in the spectrum. It was a dirty pool all the way around.
Of course, you too took a job with RCA, but before that, you spent many years at Alpine, and I know you talked in June about how it was as gracious a transition as it could have been in the way the Major let you move over to RCA. Talk a little bit about daily life at Alpine. What was it like actually being there and working with the Major?
Well, actually, most of the work with the Major was done over in Philosophy Hall, but that's where I worked also, and there was a lot of moving back and forth. My early years were spent largely at Alpine, but later, when I was close to getting my engineering degree, I spent more and more of my time over at Philosophy Hall, and most of the basic equipment like the dual channel modulator and things, those were all built at Philosophy Hall. Which I've seen some things that say it was on the first floor of Philosophy Hall, and some that, but in actual fact, I worked there, it was in the basement. You came into the building on one side, and the first thing you did was go down a big flight of stairs, which took you down into the basement. It was sort of built, I guess, on the side of a hill, but it was very informal. I know that Armstrong turned out a lot of papers and things and had to do a lot with the lawyers. He did most of that down in River House. So we were, and thank God for it, very much a paper-free society. We built things. In fact, we didn't even have formal notebooks at that point. Things were kept on paper and then put in file cabinets, but very informally. Everybody was doing it because they liked doing it, and I've often said in the past that if he hadn't paid me to be there, I think I'd have been willing to pay him to let me work there. And we had no time clocks, we had no time cards, because remember, all the work we did for the government, he was paying for out of his own pocket. And you know, I don't know, maybe 20 of us or some such number like that. About 10 or so of us were engineers, and the other 10 were technicians or operators and things. So it was we knew what had to be done, and the tendency was to do it. And there was never any formal organization chart, though it was clear that Johnny Bose, who later became a professor at Columbia, that Johnny Bose was in charge of things over in Philosophy Hall, and that Perry Osborne was in charge of things over at Alpine, but that's as far as it went. Beyond that, everybody sort of did their own thing, and one of the wonderful things for me about being there was that, you know, being young and having lots of ideas, you could mention them to him, and he said, well, you know, Rennie, go ahead and try it. He tended to call me Rennie in those days. And he said, go ahead, and you got some time, build it. And I did. So it was a wonderful place to work. And the same thing was true at Philosophy Hall, and the reason I left and went eventually with, immediately with NBC was because I had always wanted to work in television, and in way back again, I guess I was about 12 years old, I built a scanning disc television scanner and receiver, and they were really on the same shaft. They were two large discs with square holes, square apertures, and since I had no good way of synchronizing them at that time, and I was pretty young, I was just learning my way around a vacuum tube at that point, why I put them on a common shaft. And I made a picture of sorts, but I was always interested in television, and I had wanted to work on it. I had some ideas, I don't think they would work probably, but that perhaps television should be transmitted by FM, and of course that probably not a good way to do it, but I didn't realize it then, though it turned out to be a very good way to do it when you wanted to put it on a magnetic tape recorder. And he was always saying that, yeah, we'll work on that, and he was actually funding one of his friends, it was a Hammond, I guess, to build some equipment for him so we'd have some modulators and things to play with in TV. But I never got to play with them because there was other things that he felt needed being done. And finally, I guess it was in '52 or so, when the patent thing was getting down to the wire, they needed to build a 25 kilohertz ratio detector. Now, again, since we're technical people here, the ratio detector was something that RCA had invented. It was a good idea, actually, but it claimed that it didn't involve the Armstrong patents, which involved limiting and frequency discriminator, those functions. And the idea was to show that the ratio detector, though it sounds pretty good, is actually limiting and discriminating frequencies. The problem was that you couldn't get good oscilloscopes in those days to work at you wanted to be able to see all the harmonics and things. So Armstrong, to be sure that we weren't having some funny effect, wanted to build a ratio detector at 25 kilohertz. And I got the job. And I built it, and it was using, kind of technology which didn't turn me on particularly. And we had coils made out of Litz wire because he didn't trust anything with a core in it, because he thought that could be affecting things. And there was a lot of time spent with the patent lawyers. And after a while, again, I was young, I got tired of this, and I got the opportunity to take a job, again, from one of Armstrong's best friends in this case. Said, well, gee, that he knew I wanted to work in television, and NBC had a opening in their lab, and would I be interested? And I was interested, and they offered me the job. I went to NBC in the lab that were on in the fifth floor, I guess, of the RCA building, and I hadn't been there very long, about a month, I guess, when the patent office of RCA learned that, hey, there's an engineer from Armstrong, not only in the building, he's working here. And they worried that maybe, is it just possible that Armstrong has sent this guy here to be some kind of spy to see what we're doing on the other side of the patent, which of course was totally not so. And they got in contact with Armstrong, and they told me to stay home for a couple of weeks until this got decided. And Armstrong wrote a very nice letter, which I have a copy somewhere, that I'm really proud of it. He said that he had total faith in me, that he knew I would never do anything wrong, that he's sorry that I had left him, et cetera, but that we were still good friends, and that he would never, under any circumstances in the patent battle, would he bring up the fact of in any way of anything I had done or anything that I accidentally told him. Sort of paraphrasing it, but that's what it said. And so I continued at NBC, but we stayed friends, and I can still remember walking through the teletype room at NBC when the announcement came that over the teletype, that he had died, and I just couldn't believe it. I'm like Gerry and the others here. It just didn't seem right. But on the other hand, knowing a bit about his other situation, and has been done in the books and all, that he was paying for all of us. We were very close to all of us. He knew, we didn't know, that he was starting to run out of money. It was obvious it couldn't go on for much longer. Marion wanted him to settle the case. He did not want to settle it. He wanted to win. And yet he knew he was going to have to do something for the money. And I think then when she effectively said she was going to leave him if he didn't settle the case. I guess she was very happily living at River House and all, and so was he. A very expensive building, for those of you who don't know it. I think it just all came too much. And so I don't think there was anything suspicious at all about his death. I think he just honestly cracked up under a strain that anybody would.
Which brings me to Bob Brecht. Bob, was this ever discussed in the family, either at the time or in later years? Was this something that anyone had any inkling was coming?
I think that by the time I was on the scene in their summer house in Rye Beach, New Hampshire, he was becoming somewhat more remote from his family generally and more consumed by the affairs of everything that he was doing. And I think that would take a toll on anyone's marriage. And as things worsened, I think Ren is basically right. The pressure just built impossibly large and overcame him.
Your aunt survived for many, many years afterwards. Tell us a little bit about Marion Armstrong. Put her in the perspective.
Oh, she really was a remarkable woman. Certainly the fortitude that it took to continue the risk of staying in court and pursuing things to what she felt was the right end. And time proved that she was certainly no less stubborn than he was in this regard. And the performance of those suits was quite remarkable. And even after winning one or two, the others didn't fall into line very easily, and it just went on for a long time. She led a fabulous life. When all this was done, I guess living well is the best revenge, and indeed she did that. She had marvelous financial interests. She had racehorses on the European circuit and used to fly over to see them race. I can remember as a child, she had in some way rescued Uncle Howard's Hispano Suiza, which he had shipped over from Spain. And when we were up there in the summertime, she would take my sister and I for sort of madcap rides around Rye Beach, New Hampshire. And Marion was an imposing figure. She was full of confidence always. She was impeccably coiffed. I never saw Aunt Marion with a curl out of place. And when we went on these mad rides with the top down in the Hispano, she would wrap her hair in toilet paper. It must have been quite a sight, dashing around that neighborhood with two laughing and screaming kids in the back seat. I understand that while he was alive, he never let her drive the Hispano, and I think that probably was for good reason.
Is it true there's that line at the end of Empire of the Air that I got to admit gets me every time I see it when they talk about the Hispano Suiza and they end with it didn't have a radio? Is that true?
That's true. It didn't have a radio. It did, however, have two of almost everything else, 2 starter motors, 2 batteries. It had redundant systems throughout. What a magnificent car that was.
Where is the car now?
I don't know what happened to the car. At one point, I thought it was at the Smithsonian. At another point, I heard it was in a transportation museum somewhere here in New Jersey. I'm not sure. I'd love to see it again. I'd love to sit in it.
When we do this for the 75th, you got to come driving down the driveway into Alpine.
I'd like that a lot.
In the Hispano Suiza. Gerry Minter, you were saying earlier this afternoon as we were getting ready that you were sitting right in front of General Sarnoff at Armstrong's funeral.
Well, actually, what happened was we had a special ceremony, you might say a special funeral on Fifth Avenue. And Sarnoff showed up and shook hands with all of us. Amazing. I'd never met him, and he seemed to be very upset because he went along and shook hands, and as we finally filed out of the door, he stood there staring down the street, and we walked off. He just stood there. I'm sure he was upset, and he felt, maybe he felt guilty. I don't know. He certainly was sincere when he shook hands and made a point of each person. And it just shook me up a little bit. I never met him. I didn't know him at all. And most of us didn't know him. But we must have been 40 or 50 of us there. Good crowd. And yet he stood there just with hands folded, staring off in space as we walked away. And I can't help but feel that might have helped to make a settlement possible. I think he just felt that he might have been more responsible than he felt for it and felt guilty. And that's just my opinion.
It was just a few weeks after that that you went out to Alpine on March 6th of 1954 for that final broadcast. What was the mood like that night as those last musical selections were being played and they were getting ready to shut the station down for good?
It was a very strange mood. We had about, I guess, a dozen people there. Of course, first of all, we didn't want to have a lot of confusion, have too many talks, so we did everything by recording it. And I made a tape of it, and we played the tape. The people were actually there, but we used the tape to put, because we wanted to be sure everything was done in proper order and we didn't say something wrong. We, of course, made a record of it later, and I delivered some records to Mrs. Armstrong later up at Maine, up at that summer place. But it was a funny thing because I had the problem with the equipment when I went to play it. I didn't realize that he had a major problem with, my machine, of course, had a resonance circuit, which I didn't realize was there. And, of course, that's why he never used a machine like that to feed it, because it was built right into the tube. And it just happened to be right at 292 megacycles where the coil resonated. So that's the story. I mean, it was a funny feeling to go. I'd never been up there before, of course, and didn't know much about the station. And first thing I did was, you have an oscilloscope so I could make some measurements. So I had one. So I started trying to find out what was going on. And it took me a while to tell me it had to be in my unit, the fault. And we finally found it, and we soldered the thing over, and that solved the problem.
The Major would, I think, be both very proud and very fascinated by what's out at Alpine today. And there is, of course, the irony, not quite a half century after that, of the importance that the Armstrong Tower once again took in New York's communications world. Chuck Sacrament, if you can talk a little bit about what's going on out at Alpine now and about how the last couple of years have changed things for you out there.
Today, the tower acts as a regional center of telecommunications, all different types of wireless applications. It has done that since the I guess the 70s in terms of when it started to transfer into what became two-way and paging and eventually the cellular applications. Prior to 9/11, the only broadcast facilities we had at the tower were the FM station for WFDU. On 9/11, almost early in the morning, as events were unfolding, we started getting phone calls from different networks looking to try to establish some type of backup facilities to restore the services that have been lost. And from that point forward, pretty much on a round-the-clock basis, we started actively working with the first call we had received was from NBC, and it is ironic, but they were the first ones who called, so we continued, and the professionalism amongst that group to work to get everybody back on the air. Everybody had the same problems. Everybody had lost people, and they really came together and essentially just started shipping equipment towards the facility, and we were lining trucks up on the highway, trying to bring them in and load equipment and figure out what pieces could be put together to put stations back on the air. We built 5 television stations. We built a facility for PLJ there, all within a matter of days. And today it still acts as a backup facility for each of those operations.
It's remarkable to think that for at least a little while there, for a few weeks, most of New York television was coming from the Major's FM tower. Structurally, the tower is good for a good long while?
Yeah, as part of the overhaul that the tower undertook to install the permanent backup facilities, we put 2 20-foot wideband master antennas at the top of the tower, and that required a look at the structural capacity of the tower, top to bottom. The footings were upgraded. The tower was taken down to the original steel. So we actually got to see what the 1937 steel looked like, which was pretty amazing. Bolts were removed, rivets were tested, and the steel itself was tested. And the tower was completely rehabilitated. back to what it looked like in 1937, and we hope we will keep it like that for many years to come.
And best of all, it looks as though the neighbors have finally accepted that this was there long before them, and will continue to be there for longer than they will be, probably.
Yes, at the moment things are quiet with our neighbors, but
Always a battle in the world of communications these days,
yes,
as anyone who's dealt with towers knows. Steve, talk a little bit more about your role in all of this, and about how this whole transmitter came to be in there, and where you hope to go from here in the next few years to continue these WA2XMN experiments and to move this all forward.
Well, as I mentioned before, Scott, now that I've gotten granted permission from the FCC with a full 5-year experimental license, which I hope will be renewable, and I understand that's what the Major did back in his day. He just kept getting experimental licenses renewed for W2XMN, so we're on the same course, and hopefully we'll continue on with some experiments involving the Major's original Yankee network, which the first wireless FM relay links up through New England. I guess you could say the Major was the first person to conceive of that idea using radio wireless links instead of leased telephone lines, and with very high quality results, I must say. You've heard some of the recordings that were made back in the 1930s involving those links, and they were absolutely spectacular. Even to this day, they sound quite good. So,
and even given the limitations of the recording technology, more so probably than the
absolutely.
transmissions.
I mean, you could literally that original test with W1XOJ in Paxton. You could literally hear the difference from the Major's voice calling on the telephone from New York City as compared to the wideband links with the fellows involved on the radio itself, and it was remarkable. So hopefully, provided Mr. Sacrament doesn't get totally fed up with my bugging him constantly to do testing and all at the site, we'll try and recreate some of those broadcasts involving the Yankee network. Maybe we'll set up some relays and put some of the old sites, Paxton perhaps back up, Meriden Mountain, some of those original sites are still standing. The Majors, I believe both at Meriden and at Paxton, some of the original tower structures are still there from those days.
I can tell you I was at Meriden the day before the Alpine celebration in June, and the original monopole on which the antenna was mounted is still there. The building is still there. You can see the attic where the studio was.
Absolutely.
It's remarkable. Now, your transmission from Alpine was actually received up in Paxton at one point.
Yes,
right?
back, I want to say it was maybe the first week of August. Mark Humphrey, who's a broadcast engineer associate of mine from Philadelphia, has relatives actually up in the area, and Mark took a run up to Paxton, set up his vehicle with a receiver on it on the ground, and we did a test of that relay, and that's actually a considerably greater distance than the Major originally did. He had an interim facility at Meriden, and what we decided to do is try it all the way to Paxton, and what that is about a 150-mile link line of sight from Alpine up to there, and it's to give you an idea, it's about 100. It's 150 miles, and it's actually line of sight to Boston, and we had quite good receivable signals there on the ground. So I think we're off to a good start.
Mount Washington next.
Mount Washington next, right. We might have to get a little more power for that one, but we'll see what we can do.
There we go. Yeah. What did it mean, and I'll throw this question out to the panel as a whole, the gathering in Alpine in June, to see that many people, not only in the grounds, but even, from what I understand, lined up outside to pay homage to the memory of Major Armstrong. What did that mean after all these years? Anybody who wants to jump in and...
Certainly, as a member of the family, it was tremendously heartening, and it renewed my interest. My son Adam has played a great role in my growing interest in his legacy, and to be there and see him honored by so many people on that occasion was a tremendously moving experience for me. And certainly it's his due, and I am so pleased to be sitting here with these men who do so much to perpetuate his memory and to try and do that correctly. It was a tremendous event in June at Alpine, and very moving to be there walking on that ground.
Indeed, even just this morning, driving up to it again to pick Steve up to come down here, you get a tingle every time. At least I do.
It's like a goosebump moment. You know, there's a lot of tower sites you can visit. And Scott, I mean, you've certainly visited probably every one that there is in the entire country. But when you go to Alpine, you have to think that's where FM absolutely started. That's like the holy grail of tower sites, and anybody who's a broadcaster will get that goosebump feeling when he drives in there. It's hard to describe.
Again, no argument here. We should mention also that after the broadcast, there were just a real thick sheaf of reception reports that came in from a pretty wide range, including I think one from Mount Greylock up in Massachusetts.
Yeah, we did have one from Mount Greylock, which I'm not sure the distance there, but what's Greylock, about 6,000 feet?
Yeah, about 120, 140 miles.
But with our worldwide webcast, we must have had 150, 200 responses right off the bat to our website. We had a lot of people out there picking us up on vintage receivers, some current ham radio portable receivers with wideband capability. It was quite astounding. I had no idea we'd get this much response. There's a lot of people that really are quite interested in the Major's background and legacy, and it just makes me very happy that I kept it going. And
you can see those reception reports at the website, which is wa2xmn.ar88.net. And if you're tuned in on WA2XMN, you can send a reception report to WA2XMN@ar88.net. And it is WA2XMN, Alpine, New Jersey. At this point, let's open the floor to questions from the floor. Please step to one of the two microphones that's located in the aisle there. And we would be happy to take questions from you for our distinguished panel here today. We have a question.
Yes, I have a question. The design, does anyone know why the tower is designed like it is? What sort of an antenna was he using the first time that he put the FM signal on the air? I guess the immediate question I had was, are the three levels, were they meant for a direction, a gain and a 3-bay type of gain antenna? Why are they spaced, in a particular distance for that purpose, or why is the tower designed like it is?
Well, I might be able to answer your question about the original antennas. The broadcast antennas employed originally were a half-wave turnstile design, which were quite long for the frequency. And the Major actually had them suspended between those arms. It was just a convenient way of supporting that type of structure at that particular time.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that, Steve. He also had the thought and the idea, which was a good one, that since they're going to be operating on the what then was the ultra-high frequencies, or what they called it then, and people were going to use directional antennas at home in many cases, that all of the stations should be located, if there are many stations, should be as much as possible located at the same location. So he had room on the tower for putting more antennas, and he sometimes would joke, I'm not sure it was a joke, but that the people that got there first would get the upper level, and the people that came later would get the lower levels. But he clearly intended originally to have more transmitters operating from that site.
So he was ahead of his time again in co-locating various transmitters. That's a common situation that's done today to avoid interference and mixing and that sort of thing. So again, there's Major Armstrong being well ahead of his time on a very valid idea.
And it bears mentioning that that very 85th floor of Empire, another one of the doors that was down the hall in that picture that you saw earlier, step behind that, and there's the combiner room where nearly every FM station in New York City now sends its signal through on the way up to the master antenna up at the top of Empire. So co-location was real. It just ended up happening at a different spot. Dave Bialik.
Yeah, number one, this has been great, and I'm very glad to have been part of it.
I just wanted to comment. I think, if I remember correctly, Mount Greylock is about 3,400 feet, somewhere around there.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah.
I knew it was either three something or six something. So
6,000.
sorry about
something
that.
would be Mount Washington. It was 6,288 or something like that. But I have a particular curiosity about Mount Washington because in the late 80s I worked for a TV transmitter manufacturer in Massachusetts, and one of my coworkers was a gentleman named Jim Collins, who was a transmitter engineer for Yankee Network at Mount Washington. I was wondering if any of you have any information to share about that, to tell us about it.
I can actually jump in on that one, having been up in New England and having been up to the site. That was sort of the pinnacle, not just in terms of height, but in terms of achievement for the Major. The physical conditions up on Mount Washington, as you know, are among the most severe that you're going to find anywhere in the country, and they had a very narrow window each summer in which they could get this thing built. They used heavy-duty truck springs to build the antenna that was used for the Yankee Network FM station up there. And it was a station that was licensed to Boston, located on Mount Washington. It's about 180 miles from the mountain to Boston, and that thing got in beautifully, too, from what I understand. And it really sort of proved the point that in areas that were difficult to reach by traditional broadcasting, and especially in northern New England, where the ground conductivity is just atrocious and makes AM radio very difficult to use in any sort of efficient manner, that here was a broadcast technology that could span those distances and that could cover substantially all of New England from a single location, as well as being a very easy one-shot hop from Paxton. And so that was the northern edge of the Yankee network. There were plans to build another station at Mount Mansfield in Vermont that never really reached fruition. But that was a very important part of the Major's early FM network, and the building survived the fire up there a few years ago that destroyed the TV transmitter. And the Yankee building is still up there, and there are still remnants of the Armstrong legacy up there to be seen. So it's actually all those sites really are still being used for FM radio. Certainly the Meriden site is used for almost all the Hartford stations. The Paxton site is being used by several of the Worcester stations. So those sites really, they were well chosen both for their day and for today. Do we have other questions?
Yes, I was curious what the height of the current WA2XMN antenna is. Where is it on the existing tower?
Well, we actually have it up at the 400-foot level. I believe it's right next to maybe 20-25 feet east of the Channel 2 bat wing, so it's right up on the very top of the structure right now.
Okay.
And it's only a simple half-wave vertical, not quite the Major's turnstile, but it was light, it was easy to carry up, and it did the job for us, at least to get started.
Right.
Yep.
The other thing I was curious about, obviously the original Yankee network, the transmitter power they were using for those transmitters was a great deal higher than what you have now. And yet you seem to be saying that you can reestablish an adequate link over those same distances. I mean, did he really have that much margin over what was necessary?
We just proved that we could actually do the 150-mile link. We actually did it. We actually proved it. Of course, when you have 30,000 watts of power, you can certainly penetrate buildings much better. Your receivers don't have to have the sensitivity or the external antennas like they didn't really have in the 1930s. So, of course, nowadays the receiver technology is a little bit better. They're a little tighter. They're a little more sensitive. So naturally, it would be better if we had more power. We'd probably have a much stronger signal, but we can actually still make it on this low power that we have, and we're only running about 1/4 of a kilowatt, believe it or not.
Go ahead.
Could you gentlemen talk about the link between Alpine and Washington, D.C., which was part of the experiment?
I'm not sure of the question, but AT&T did give us another 15 kilohertz line, which covered some of the Navy band, I think it was, concerts. But I'm trying to remember, and I honestly don't remember, whether or not we did a relay from Washington to Alpine, or whether we sent one the other way, from Alpine down to Washington.
Alpine to Washington, as far as I know.
Yeah.
There were broadcasts. Everett Dillard, I believe it was, at WASH, had some early broadcasts down there of Armstrong material. There's some material out there on the web. I don't know if it's on Mike's site, or there's another site that's maintained up in New England that has a lot of information on some of the early FM relays that sprung off from the Armstrong network over the years. Perhaps Herb Squire, who's now stepping to the microphone, has some more information about that. Herb?
Well, I'm still trying to piece together some of the fine details of the W71NY broadcast from November 30th, 1941, which included the live originations from many of the other stations. Unfortunately, the only discs that I was able to find when I was transferring the material back many, many moons ago at WOR was W43B in Boston, and W65H in Hartford. Now, in addition, in the dedicatory broadcast, which originated from the W71NY transmitter in Manhattan, there was mention of the Philadelphia station, which was owned by WFIL, and the Schenectady station, which, of course, was part of WGY and General Electric. And, well, I believe the Washington station was all part of that broadcast. Now, I don't know if, in fact, all the stations were originating or not. I have a feeling that might have been. Unfortunately, I've never been able to find any information on the transcriptions from those days.
It's amazing that we at least have the material that we have. How did you come across that, Herb?
Well, back when I was, my early days at WR, this is back in the late 1960s, there was an effort to preserve things as far as news information items. I transferred discs from like the entire night of December 7th, 1941, just recording the WOR program line that they wanted to archive the shows and everything. That was fantastic to hear that, just listening to regular programs being interrupted by certain reserve groups being called to active duty, and news reports from Washington and other cities as to their reaction regarding the attack on Pearl Harbor. And among these discs, I found, now all these discs were actually stored in a janitor's closet on the 15th floor of 1440 Broadway, not well protected. In other words, there were a lot of the discs, especially from the 1940 and 41 era, which, because of the war effort, even before we got into the war, the transcriptions were not aluminum-based, they were glass-based. And if somebody just bumped something against that stack of discs, you could have shattered glass, and of course, everything was lost. And that may have happened with many of the discs that were done from November 30th, 1941, the W71NY broadcast.
And of course, my upstate New York pride requires me to mention that in later years, the FM relays also extended well upstate, and there were FM over-the-air relays proving the Major's point on a very regular daily basis all the way up as far as Rochester and Buffalo and northern New York. So clearly the technology worked, and Herb, I think, has another addition to make to that.
Of course, with inflation, it's higher than the 2 cents. But I do have maps of some of the early Northeast Radio Network, which was then known as the Rural Radio Network in the early 1950s, as well as the WQXR network, which actually was the last of the networks that lasted through 1963. And the reason that stopped, because they lost the network, because the over-the-air relay was lost when they built the Pan Am building, which is now the MetLife building, because the transmitter facility for WQXR, which was on the Shannon building, 42nd Street, across from Grand Central Station, was not high enough to clear this new structure.
And I believe that the the transmission facilities on top of the MetLife building are now a CSC management facility as well.
That's correct.
Interesting irony.
Small world.
Irony City tonight. We have another question.
This is for Steve. Could you tell us a little bit about the background of how you came to the design and form factor, et cetera, of your transmitter, and what the differences and similarities would be between the transmitter that's in use right now and what the Majors would have been?
Oh, sure. Unfortunately, the transmitter that I built is actually a newer version than the Major used. Major Armstrong actually used the dual channel phase modulator, where I used a slightly more modern technique using the GE Phasotron. So the Phasotron uses considerably less stages of multiplication to get the signal of the originating signal from the crystal up to the carrier, where it was the Major had to multiply thousands of times. The Phasotron was a more modern technique, which you only had to multiply about 400 times, because the tube itself is just capable of much wider swings of modulation down at the low 100 kilohertz carrier frequency. Even though the Major started down there as well, his technique just required quite a bit more multiplication. So I probably stand guilty for not making the exact version that he used, but I had a personal love of the Phasotron myself. I was always fascinated by its design, how unique it is for generating FM. And in fact, my original high school that I graduated from back in the 70s used a Phasotron rig at my school station, and it kind of left a lasting impression on me, and always wanted to kind of follow up and build a recreation of that. So kind of the two things kind of blended together. So maybe I should get a dual modulator in the works somewhere along the way and do it a little more originally in the future. And that's not out of line. I may do that.
I wouldn't rule it out at all, knowing you.
Rule it out, exactly right. Yeah.
Knowing you. Any further audience questions? Last call.
Yeah, I just want to mention during my beginning of my career in Washington, D.C., I found out the station I was working at, WAMU FM, their original transmitter, which was built and dedicated by Major Armstrong, was donated to the Smithsonian. In one of their warehouses, that transmitter exists now, and allegedly they were going to put a display together, but they have not, and that was in the early 80s I found that out.
Is that a dual modulator, do you think, Dave?
I don't know.
I know the guy to restore it if they're ever interested.
Yeah, boy. I'd love to have at it.
We have about 10 minutes left to us here, and I just kind of want to go down the panel for some closing thoughts. And I want to ask, and perhaps those of you who knew the Major best, especially Ren, can jump in on this. What do you think you would have made if he could have walked the show floor here at AES and seen today's technology? What do you think the Major would have made of it all?
I'm glad you asked that, because I thought of that as I was walking around outside, and to think that it might still have happened, but it would have been many years later if he hadn't did what he did. Because remember, when FM went on, it was that quality, and to get the quality, he did things like getting Klipschorns, which nobody even knew what they were back then, and the REL built a speaker system, a sort of a woofer-tweeter speaker system. Nobody had ever heard a speaker of that kind before. Now, of course, there are thousands of them. And all of the test equipment. And I thought there, gee whiz, I'm sure he would have had the same thought I had. If only we had had that equipment back there in the 60s and 70s to measure things. I can't tell you how many hours and days were spent trying to get the hum down in the system. And when we got it down to 70 dB or so, with the rather crude measurement gear we had, excuse me, Hewlett-Packard, but it was Hewlett-Packard gear, we were so happy. But to do it, the transmitter at Alpine was largely on operating the filaments. We're all operating on DC. We had a motor generator set to generate DC. Some of the other demonstrations We took along, they were AC operated receivers, but when we went for the demos, we took storage batteries and hooked the filaments up to storage batteries, because in those days, and with the equipment we had to work with and the measuring equipment, it was very hard to get things down below 70 dB, believe me, and not trivial at all. And until you get down there, and a little below if you can still hear a little bit of hum. And Armstrong liked to give these demonstrations where everything would be turned on and the audience, whether a small one or a big audience, wouldn't realize that the microphones were live at the other end. And then somebody would do something like hitting a triangle or some frequency that you wouldn't normally ever get over an AM system. And I just think that he would be astounded with the wonderful gadgets you've got out there now. And he liked gadgets, by the way. And if there was new equipment around, he would buy it. And so we weren't lacking that way, but we were lacking the fact that there just wasn't the equipment. So I think he'd say, boy, what the world is coming to, and gee, I started all this, and I hope he'd be proud as hell, because he should be.
Gerry or Gil, any further thoughts on what the Major might make of today's technology?
Very proud of where we are today and where we will be going. I'm certain that Ren put it a lot better.
Any closing thoughts, Mike, from the historical perspective?
Well, I actually think he would be right comfortable with where technology is today. I think he'd be right at home here. Now, that's assuming he just didn't pop up out of thin air and suddenly get planted here. But I think he'd really be at home if he had grown up with the technology that he started. He'd love it. He'd be right at home here.
I almost hate to ask, with Leonard Kahn sitting right in the front row, what would he have made of the digital modulation that's threatening to overtake his beloved analog FM on the radio dials? Now we've got him coming up to the mic.
No, I think he'd. I don't want to talk about that, but I just want to say he was a very nice man. And he'd be at home, except when it comes to the patent system. He'd be very disturbed what's going on. You folks, all of you should be watching that, because they're trying to destroy it. I don't know if you know, he funded at Columbia University a study of what was going on with patents at the time. If he saw what's going on right now, there's a bill in Congress absolutely will destroy the patent system. So you better start being real secretive on any new things you have. But I knew him from the other side. I worked for Murray Crosby. I worked for RCA. And everybody loved the man, including Sarnoff. Sarnoff, you know, his wife was Sarnoff's secretary, as you know. And there was no animosity from Sarnoff. Sarnoff was a very nice guy, very nice person. And so was Murray Crosby.
Thank you, Mr. Kahn. Any final closing thoughts from the family side, from Bob Brecht?
Yeah, thank you. I spoke with my cousin Jean Hammond yesterday, who worked for Uncle Howard at Philosophy Hall. And on her behalf, I'd like to say thank you to everyone here, and thank you for all the work that's been done to keep his legacy alive. It's a great American story. It's a tragic American story. And these are people whose achievements are just, even today, stunning, and who live their lives large. And anything that you gentlemen have done to help keep that memory alive is, you have the eternal gratitude of this family. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes our panel discussion and our broadcast today. We have many people to thank for their help in making this presentation possible. Here at the Audio Engineering Society, David Bialik, Irv Joel, and John Chester. At APT, Art Constantine provided the codecs to get our audio from this room to the show floor. Herb Squire of DSI for the Redline radio link from Javits to the Empire State Building. Kevin Plum and Mark Kordash at WPLJ provided the ISDN lines from Empire over to Alpine. Marvin Caesar from AFEX helped out with some processing. Paul McLean at Radio World made my appearance possible today. Bob Bartola is our master control operator, manning the boards over at WA2XMN in Alpine. The crew at CSC, Chuck Sacrament, Dave Amundsen, Randy Bleiweiss. Al Clace is the webmaster at wa2xmn.ar88.net. If you've tuned into our 42.8 megahertz transmission, we welcome your reception reports at the website or by email at wa2xmn@ar88.net. Our panelists today, Bob Brecht, Steve Hempel, Gil Hauk, Mike Katsdorn, Ren McMahon, Gerry Minter, and Chuck Sacrament. I'm your moderator, Scott Feibush, here at the AES in New York City. We close our broadcast with the last audio that was heard on the Major's original Alpine station on March 6, 1954. We thank you for joining us.
This is station KE2XCC at Alpine, New Jersey, concluding a special program in memory of Major Edwin H. Armstrong. This is the last program of our 15 years of broadcasting. To our faithful audience of music lovers, we say thanks for your attention and your letters of praise and criticism. Goodbye and good luck. As we now prepare to pull the switch and shut the station down, we salute the memory of Edwin Howard Armstrong.